Hello everyone, my name is Fritz and welcome to Maths 24. Our lesson of this day is titled The Inverse of Functions Part 1. In this particular tutorials, we are going to be showing you some short tricks using flowcharts. Let us start by taking a daily example. For example, a plane flies from Florida to Ontario and from Ontario to London. Then this route is the function g. Let us call this route the function g. Let's assume that this plane has to return using the same route. In this particular case, there is no other route. It has to use just the same route used to going to London, and now the path will be as follows: from London to Ontario, now to Florida, and this is the path that has been traced. The path that brings the plane back to its origin is called the inverse function. So the inverse function is that function that brings members from the codomain back to the domain, or maps them back to the domain, and is written as g to the power minus 1. In this case, since the function was g, but it's read as g inverse, not g to the power minus 1, but read as g inverse. Equally, we can write the inverse without even solving for anything. Let's look at some simple tricks to get the inverse of some simple functions without solving. And we have to take all of this into consideration. If you have the function to add 5, the inverse of adding 5 is subtract 5. For example, if you have g of x is equal to x plus 5, the inverse function will be g inverse of x to be equal to x minus 5. If you have the function to subtract 2, the inverse will be add 2. For example, if f of x is mapped onto x minus 2, then the inverse will be f inverse of x is mapped onto x plus 2. Equally, if you have to multiply a function by 6, the inverse is to divide by 6. For example, 6x has inverse x on 6. And dividing by 4, for example, the inverse is to multiply by 4. Therefore, the function x on 4 will have an inverse of 4x. These are simple short tricks and curves to get the inverse of a function without solving for anything. But these are all one-step functions. At times, we may have 2 or more steps. Now, let's use some flowcharts to solve some examples. Example 1, find the inverse of the function f of x equals x plus 3. The first thing here is to have an x, and then you add 3. That gives us the function. The inverse function is to move back. So you start with an x, you subtract 3, and you have x minus 3. So the inverse function here is f inverse of x equals x minus 3. Example 2, we have find the inverse of the function c of x is mapped onto 5x. In this case, we have x, you multiply by 5 to have 5x. The inverse will be you start with an x, you divide by 5 to have x on 5. And the inverse function is t inverse such that x is mapped on to x on 5. Example 3, we have h of x equals 2x plus 3. And the inverse, to get the inverse, first of all, get the function. This one is a two-step function. So you take x and multiply by 2, you have 2x. Then you add 3 to this to have 2x plus 3. Now, to have the inverse, you start from the last operation you used in getting the function. So you have an x, then instead of adding 3, you subtract 3 to have x minus 3. Then the next operation is, instead of multiplying by 2, you divide by 2 to have x minus 3 on 2. So the inverse of this function is h inverse of x equals x minus 3 on 2. And the final example, we have g such that x mapped onto x plus 5 on 4. Find the inverse. So we have x, we add 5 to have x plus 5, then we divide all through by 4 to have x plus 5 on 4. We now have the function. To have the inverse function, we start with the last step using x at the beginning. Note that you always start with x, so we have x, you divide, instead of dividing by 4, you now multiply by 4 to have 4x, and instead of adding 5, the inverse is to subtract 5, and that gives us 4x minus 5. So the inverse of this function is 4x minus 5. Thank you so much, and don't forget to like our videos, to share them, to subscribe and click on the notifications. Bye bye.